My father made me run his company for 10 years, while telling everyone my younger brother was the real heir. The first time I realized my father meant to erase me, he did it with a smile on his face and a hand on my shoulder. There were 200 people in the ballroom that night, crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a string quartet in the corner trying to make a manufacturing awards dinner feel like a royal wedding. My suit was still warm from the dry cleaner, and I had not eaten since noon because I had spent the entire afternoon calming a supplier crisis in Ohio, talking a freight carrier out of canceling a route, and rewriting the production forecast for the fourth quarter after our CFO discovered, with the kind of panic only useless people manage, that he had somehow approved 2 sets of numbers that did not match. I fixed it before 6. I always fixed it. By 7:30, I was standing beside my father near the stage, still answering emails under the table while executives from other firms shook his hand and told him how extraordinary Sterling Industrial looked this year. He accepted every compliment as if success were something that happened naturally around him, the way weather settles over a town. Then one of the board members, an old man named Benton Hale, laughed and raised a glass toward me. He said the company was lucky my father had a son like me. He said every time he called the office, I was the one who answered the real questions. He said, in front of my father, in front of donors and local politicians and regional press, that I was clearly the engine keeping the whole machine alive. My father smiled. He squeezed my shoulder, and then he said, calm as prayer, that every king needs a good general, but everyone in the room knew who the real heir was. He lifted his glass toward my younger brother, Julian, 26 years old at the time. Beautiful in the careless way some men are beautiful because nobody has ever made them pay for anything. A navy tuxedo, a loose grin, a champagne flute he had not bought, and a woman on his arm whose father owned 3 car dealerships and half a county in political influence. Julian had worked at the company for 11 months, most of them in brand development, which meant posting photos of factory tours, pretending to understand margins, and arriving late enough every day that people had stopped expecting him before 10:30. The room laughed softly, politely. The kind of laugh wealthy people use when they are being told where reality ends and performance begins. My father said I had always been dependable, that I had a gift for operations, that I understood the bones of the business. Then he said Julian had vision. He said some sons are born to carry the weight, and some are born to wear the crown. I remember the exact sensation in my chest when he said it. It was something colder than that. Recognition, maybe. The feeling of finally hearing the truth, stated plainly in a room full of witnesses. I smiled because I had been trained to smile. My father liked to tell people that my greatest strength was discipline. What he meant was obedience. I had worked at Sterling Industrial since I was 16, first in the mailroom, then in inventory, then on the floor, then in procurement, then in logistics, then in plant coordination, then in operations. I knew every warehouse code we had used over the last decade. I knew which supervisors drank too much, which ones lied on maintenance reports, which trucking firms cut corners, which clients needed reassurance before they renewed, and which machines made a noise that meant they would fail 3 weeks later if nobody shut them down for service. I knew the company in the way people know places they have bled for. My father knew it the way a man knows a house after inheriting it fully furnished. My name is Daniel Sterling, and for 10 years I ran my father's company while he told anyone who would listen that my younger brother was the future. That is not how it starts. It starts in childhood usually. It starts with small measurements. Who gets forgiven first? Who gets watched harder? Who is called gifted? Who is called difficult? Who is told to rest? Who is told to help? Julian and I had different mothers, though nobody used that phrase in the house. My mother died when I was 9, and after that the subject of her became something delicate and expensive, like a vase nobody wanted near the edge of the table. My father remarried 2 years later. Julian was the result of that second marriage, though our father never made us use terms like half-brother. In photographs, we wore matching jackets in winter and stood shoulder to shoulder at charity events. In private, the difference was simpler. I was the child who had belonged to a woman my father had once loved quietly. Julian was the child born after my father became the kind of man who wanted to be seen loving loudly. When I was 12, I spilled orange juice on a folder in my father's study and got lectured for 20 minutes about carelessness. When Julian was 12, he backed a golf cart into a decorative stone wall at the country club, and my father told the story for years because it showed what a fearless spirit he had. When I was 15, I asked for help paying for a summer leadership program my school counselor recommended. My father said character is built through work, not handouts. So I spent the summer in one of the warehouses sorting late shipments and learning how to file receiving discrepancies. When Julian turned 15, my father bought him a membership at a private athletic club because confidence, he said, was an investment. Most people did. He had the polished kindness of men who understand how power sounds when it is pretending to be wisdom. He remembered names. He sent flowers when someone in the office lost a parent. He donated to libraries and scholarship funds and medical drives. He had a way of pausing before he spoke that made people assume every sentence had depth. He never yelled in public. He never needed to. He understood something louder than anger. The value of making you complicit in your own humiliation. He rarely said I was not enough. He just described Julian as more. I was never fully rejected. I was used too carefully for that. My father needed me useful. He just never needed me honored. After the awards dinner, I drove home alone in silence. I did not turn on music. I did not call anyone. The city had that polished nighttime look it gets near the holidays. Wet streets reflecting gold from storefront windows, strangers moving behind restaurant glass, taxis shining at intersections like beetles. I remember stopping at a red light and staring at my own hands on the steering wheel. They looked older than I felt. My townhouse was neat in the way lonely homes often are, everything in its place, nothing left out by accident. I had a coffee mug in the sink, a folded jacket over the dining chair, an unread book face down near the couch. I stood in my kitchen for a while without taking off my shoes, still hearing the sentence in my father's voice. Some sons are born to carry the weight, and some are born to wear the crown. There are phrases that only hurt because they explain your life all at once. That was one of them. The next morning, I was at the office before 6. Our headquarters sat outside Baltimore in a low glass building that had been renovated 3 times in 20 years to make old money look modern. There was a lobby with local art and brushed steel signage and a coffee station no one on the floor ever had time to use. The executive wing was all soft carpeting and quiet doors. The operations side, where I spent most of my life, carried a different smell. Printer toner, burnt coffee, cardboard dust, machine oil that clung to jackets after plant visits, the smell of actual work. I liked arriving early because the building told the truth before people got there. When the lights were half on and the parking lot almost empty, the company belonged to systems instead of personalities. Numbers still had integrity. Orders still had destinations. Problems were still just problems. By 8:15, the lies began. At 9, Julian arrived. He came in wearing a camel coat he swung over one shoulder like he had seen someone do it in a film. He had sunglasses on indoors, a paper cup from a coffee shop 3 blocks out of his way, and the kind of easy smile that made receptionists think they were being confided in when he said their names. He stopped at my office door and tapped the frame. He asked if I had a minute. Julian always asked like that, as if time were something he had recently discovered other people might own. I said yes. He stepped in, sat down without being invited, and said, Father thought it would be good for us to be more aligned going into the new year. He said the board wanted him to take on a more visible strategic role. He said he would need broader access to internal reporting, vendor data, labor metrics, and client renewal history so he could start thinking long-term. That phrase, thinking long-term. Men like Julian loved phrases that sounded important from a distance. I asked if our father had approved full access. Julian smiled and said of course. Then he leaned back and said, with the cheerful, casual cruelty of someone who had never had to examine himself too closely, that I should not look so worried. He said nobody was replacing me. He said every kingdom needed a strong second man. He laughed after he said it. I did not. I opened my laptop, submitted the permissions request, and told him he would need a briefing before he interpreted any of the reports. He said that would be great. He said maybe we could make it fun. I remember looking at him and thinking that there are people who move through the world as if consequences are an administrative burden someone else was born to carry for them. I had known that about my brother for years. What I had not fully accepted until then was that our father intended to build an empire around that flaw and call it succession. For the next 6 months, my life became more crowded and more invisible at the same time. Julian was added to meetings he did not understand. He was introduced to clients I had managed for years. He began sending late-night emails full of vague directives about innovation, restructuring, narrative alignment, market repositioning, brand prestige, executive presence, and cultural evolution. Whenever one of his ideas failed, which was often, my father framed the failure as growing pains. When one of my departments missed a target by half a point, my father called it a warning sign. The company itself was not glamorous. Sterling Industrial manufactured specialty components used in commercial refrigeration systems, agricultural processing equipment, and mid-scale utility hardware. Nothing about it invited admiration from outsiders, which may be why my father cared so much about appearances. He could not make the product elegant, so he made the mythology elegant instead. Legacy, stewardship, family, American grit, the kind of words rich men use when they want labor to sound poetic. Underneath all that language, the business survived on precision. Timelines, supplier reliability, safety compliance, shipping discipline, real margins, real people. That was my world. It was never Julian's. Still, our father treated competence like plumbing, essential, invisible, and unworthy of applause. One Tuesday in February, we had an emergency at Plant 2. A subcontractor had delivered alloy stock that did not meet spec, but the discrepancy was subtle enough that a rushed floor inspection might have missed it. If it had gone into production, we could have compromised 3 months of outbound orders and exposed ourselves to returns, legal risk, maybe even a product recall. I caught it because I still reviewed exception batches personally when something in the paperwork felt off. I drove out there myself in sleet, spent 6 hours on the floor, froze my feet in steel-toe boots, reclassified the entire inbound shipment, found 2 alternate vendors, negotiated a split load overnight, and kept the line running with only a 12-hour disruption. At 7 that evening, I got back to headquarters soaked to the knees. Our father had left already. Julian was in the executive conference room with 2 board members and a marketing consultant, presenting a slide deck about our company's next era identity. The next morning, my father called me into his office. He did not ask how Plant 2 had been contained. He did not mention the recall we had avoided. He did not ask how many hours the rerouting cost or how close we had come to missing contractual shipping windows. He said he had heard I looked tired in front of the staff. He said leaders must project control during disruptions. Then he told me Julian had impressed Benton Hale with some excellent strategic thinking over dinner. I stood there while he said it. I remember the sunlight slanting across the carpet. I remember the smell of cedar from the cabinet behind him. I remember thinking that if a stranger had walked into the room and watched us, They would have assumed he was talking to a disappointing son rather than the reason his company was still profitable, I said. Plant 2 had been contained. He nodded. I said the alloy issue could have triggered major exposure. He nodded again. Then he said that was exactly why he valued me. Valued me. That word stayed with me all day. Not respected, not trusted, not celebrated, valued. A horse can be valued. A machine can be valued. A lockbox can be valued. The months kept moving. Spring turned the grounds around headquarters green again. The company hosted its annual charity luncheon. Julian gave a speech about innovation and legacy that I had essentially written for him after our father asked me to help him sound more grounded. He mispronounced one client's last name, forgot one of our plant supervisors had retired 6 months earlier, and still received a standing ovation because he was young and handsome and spoke with the confidence of someone who had never once been publicly corrected. Around that time, I made the mistake of thinking someone inside the family might still see what was happening clearly. My father's second wife, Mary Ann, had always been careful with me. Never cruel, never warm. She treated me the way some women treat furniture they would not have chosen but have learned to decorate around. We could be pleasant. We could discuss schedules, holidays, health updates, charitable events, table settings, renovations. But there was always the faint sense that we were standing in a room neither of us fully belonged in. Still, one Sunday at their house after lunch, while my father and Julian were on the patio discussing a golf tournament, Mary Ann found me in the kitchen rinsing a glass. She asked if I was all right. It was such a simple question that I nearly answered honestly. Instead, I said I was fine. She dried her hands slowly and said my father depended on me more than he knew how to say. There are sentences people offer as comfort when they are too loyal to the system hurting you to tell the truth directly. I asked whether he depended on me or used me. She did not answer right away. She said family businesses are complicated. I asked whether Julian had ever spent a full day in any of the plants before being called visionary. She said my father saw something in him. I asked if anyone had ever tried seeing something in me besides endurance. That landed. I could tell it landed because she looked down. Then she said very quietly that being the reliable one is sometimes its own kind of power. Even then, I had the uneasy sense that she was not defending him so much as defending the arrangement she had lived inside for years. I smiled then, though not because I agreed with her. People say things like that when they have mistaken suffering for moral distinction, as if being overlooked with dignity is somehow more noble than being chosen, as if the child who gets less should feel flattered by how much can apparently be extracted from him without visible complaint. I left soon after that. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station, bought terrible coffee, and sat in my car watching rain move across the windshield in little silver lines. I thought about my mother then, not in a sentimental way, more like an ache in the shape of a question. What would my life have become if she had lived long enough to stand between me and my father's design for me? Would she have named what was happening sooner? Would I have had the vocabulary for it before I built my whole adult identity around being indispensable to people who withheld love as management strategy? I did not know. I still do not. What I do know is that there is a moment in every long injustice when the injured person begins to wonder whether he is participating in his own diminishment. That question is dangerous. It does not arrive as rebellion at first. It arrives as fatigue, then clarity, then shame for how long clarity took. By midsummer, the board had begun formal succession conversations, not public ones, not the kind that show up in minutes. Quiet dinners, side meetings, weekend calls. My father was too vain to retire soon, but not too vain to enjoy being treated like a man whose eventual transition mattered. He loved the theater of it, loved hearing what people imagined the next generation could become. I was not invited to most of those conversations. I knew they were happening because I had to prepare the briefing packets. That was the shape of my life by then. building the evidence of my own exclusion. One Friday evening, my father asked me to come by his house after work. The message was short. Just his name on my screen, then need to discuss next quarter. Come by at 8. No greeting. No please. The house where he lived with Marianne. And Julian sat on a rise outside the city, all stone and symmetry and old oaks, the kind of place that looked inherited even when it was not. I had grown up in an earlier version of that house, before the renovations, before my father discovered he could buy permanence as a style. Julian's car was already in the drive when I arrived. So was Benton Hale's, and one of the other board members. That should have told me enough. A maid took my coat. I could hear voices in the study. The door was open when I reached it. My father was standing by the fireplace with a drink. Benton was in one leather chair, another board member in the second. Julian was leaning against the bookshelves, looking pleased with himself in that mild, self-satisfied way he wore when he believed life was unfolding according to its natural order. My father said, "There he is," as if I had arrived late to something festive. I went in. He asked me to sit. I did not. He said the board had been discussing ways to structure the future more efficiently. He said the company needed clearer public-facing leadership. He said investors, lenders, and strategic partners responded to narrative as much as numbers now. He said Julian was especially well-suited to represent the family's vision going forward. Then, because he was a man who liked cruelty best when it wore a business suit, he said my own role was too important to be distracted by ceremonial concerns. Ceremonial concerns. That was how he described authority. He said the tentative plan, still informal, still evolving, would be to position Julian as executive vice president over strategic development and family continuity. He would be elevated visibly over the next year, mentored more closely, and introduced more aggressively to outside stakeholders as the likely successor. My father turned to me and said, with practiced solemnity, that he wanted me beside him through all of it. He said nobody knew the company like I did. He said Julian would need me. He said families endure because everyone accepts the role best suited to them. Benton gave me a sympathetic look that made me dislike him more than open hostility would have. Julian said he knew this was probably a lot to process. A lot to process. I think something in me went very still at that moment. I asked whether this discussion was truly informal. My father said, of course. I asked whether compensation, governance authority, and signing control were also under discussion. He narrowed his eyes slightly. That expression meant he had hoped for emotion, because emotion is easier to dismiss than precision. He said details would come later. I asked whether Julian had reviewed the debt restructuring notes from March, whether he understood our vendor concentration risk in the Southeast Corridor, whether he knew how many compliance exposures we were tracking across the plants, whether he could explain the margin pressure caused by the new steel contract without using words like synergy or momentum. Julian's face changed a little then. Not much. Just enough. My father said that was exactly the kind of bitterness he hoped I would rise above. That word, bitterness, as if accuracy were a flavor problem. I looked at him for a long time before I spoke again. Then I asked him one question. I asked whether there had ever been a version of his future where I was allowed to inherit what I had spent my adult life preserving. No one answered right away. The silence in that room had weight to it. Firelight, crystal, leather, expensive air. My father finally said this was not personal. Anyone who says that after wounding you has already decided your humanity is an inconvenience. I said of course it was personal. I said he had made it personal every time he praised Julian for qualities he had never required him to prove. Every time he treated my labor as loyalty and my loyalty as obligation. Every time he confused being needed with being honored. Every time he asked me to hold the company together while presenting my brother as the one born to own it. Marianne appeared in the doorway during that part. I do not know how long she had been standing there. My father's face hardened. Not with rage, with offense. That was always his truest emotion when challenged. Offense that someone had interrupted the order of things by naming them. He said I was being emotional. I said no, I was being exact. Julian told me I was making this harder than it had to be. I turned and looked at him. I said the reason everything in his life felt easy was that somebody else was always being made to carry the hard part. That shut him up. My father stepped closer then and lowered his voice, which meant he had become dangerous. He said if I wanted to stay with Sterling Industrial, I needed to remember who I was speaking to. I remember that sentence almost as vividly as the one from the ballroom. Not because it frightened me, because of how much it revealed. After 10 years of solving his disasters, after all the nights, all the salvaged contracts, all the invisible rescues, he still believed my place in that room depended on permission rather than contribution. That was the moment the structure cracked for me, not outwardly, not dramatically, inside. Like ice breaking across a lake so deep the sound takes a second to reach the surface. I said I remembered exactly who I was speaking to. Then I said something I had never allowed myself to say out loud before. I said if he wanted Julian to inherit the company, then he should start letting Julian run it. No one moved. My father stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. Benton shifted in his chair. Marianne put one hand to her throat. Julian actually laughed once, a short disbelieving sound, and asked whether I was serious. I said I had never been more serious in my life. My father said that was childish. I said no. What was childish was grooming a mascot for the throne while expecting the workhorse to die in harness without complaint. He told me not to be theatrical in his home. I said then let us be practical. I told him I would remain through the end of the quarter. At the time, I still believed I could leave cleanly at quarter's end, before the board, the lawyers, and my father's counterattack turned a private boundary into a much longer war. I would document all active operational systems, open exposures, contract sensitivities, and plant-level dependencies. I would transition authority where needed. After that, if he truly believed Julian was the future, I would step aside and let the future demonstrate itself. Julian's face had gone pale by then, though he was trying very hard to look amused. My father said I was threatening the family. I said he had mistaken boundaries for betrayal because he had spent too long benefiting from sons who knew the difference, but were never allowed to use it. Then I picked up my coat and left. I wish I could say I drove away feeling triumphant. I did not. I drove away shaking. There is grief inside liberation sometimes. Real grief. The kind that catches in the body before the mind can sort it. At a stoplight halfway home, I had to pull over because my hands would not stay steady on the wheel. I sat there with the engine running and the air conditioning too cold, and realized I had just done the one thing I had organized my entire life to avoid. I had disappointed my father openly. Some people spend years trying to understand why that matters after the father himself has proven unworthy of such power. The answer is simple and humiliating. Children do not stop wanting recognition just because recognition becomes impossible. They only learn how to bury the wanting under competence and irony and adulthood and work. That night, I barely slept. By 6:30 the next morning, my father had emailed me 3 times. The first message was brisk, as if the study confrontation had been a misunderstanding between rational men. He said we should revisit the tone of last evening and keep our focus where it belonged. The second was colder. He said my position at Sterling Industrial came with duties that exceeded personal sensitivity. The third arrived just before dawn. He said very plainly that emotional instability at the executive level could not be indulged indefinitely. I read that one twice. Emotional instability. It was a clever phrase, designed to provoke, but also to create a record. That was when I understood he had already moved past family. He was preparing to make me the problem professionally if I did not fold quickly enough. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and for the first time in years I started keeping a private file that was not meant to save the company. It was meant to save me. Not revenge, not yet, just record. Timeline of decisions, email chains, permissions. Verbal directives summarized in writing. Access transfers requested by Julian. Operational overrides proposed by Julian. Board conversations I had been asked to support without inclusion. Risk assessments ignored after I submitted them. Instances where my father recast my work as support for my brother's leadership narrative. The file grew quickly. Truth often does once you stop protecting the people who benefit from its omission. That Monday, Julian walked into headquarters with a new title draft already circulating in HR, Executive Vice President, Strategic Development, and Family Continuity. I looked at the screen for a long time when I saw it. Family continuity. You could spend a lifetime studying how rich people rename entitlement until it sounds like governance. At 10 that morning, my father called a leadership meeting. He announced several forward-looking structural updates. He praised Julian's expanding public role. He described me as the cornerstone of operational excellence. That was the phrase he used. Cornerstone. Useful. Load-bearing. Stuck in place. He said the future of Sterling Industrial would rest on both sons working in harmony. People around the table nodded, took notes, avoided my eyes. I realized then that institutions teach cowardice very efficiently. Most people do see what is happening. They simply measure the cost of saying so and decide truth is a luxury for someone with less to lose. After the meeting, one of our senior plant managers, a man named Arturo Vega, who had worked with me for 7 years, stepped into my office and shut the door. He asked if I was all right. I almost laughed at the repetition of that question in my life. People kept asking it as if well-being were a mood rather than a structure. I said I would be. He nodded once and said very carefully that the floor trusted me, not the title. Then he added something that stayed with me. He said when people stop fearing the man who actually knows where everything breaks, that is usually when the breaking starts. He was right. I did not know yet how right. I only knew that for the first time in my adult life, I was no longer trying to save my father from the consequences of choosing his favorite son over the son who kept the lights on. And once that knowledge settled in me, quiet and cold and strangely clean, I understood the season of my obedience had finally ended. And once that knowledge settled in me, quiet and cold and strangely clean, I understood the season of my obedience had finally ended. 3 weeks later, the first visible crack appeared, and it arrived wearing one of Julian's favorite disguises, confidence. The first visible crack appeared 3 weeks later, and it arrived wearing one of Julian's favorite disguises, confidence. He called it modernization. He called a meeting with procurement, logistics, and regional plant leads without consulting me, which was new but not surprising. By then, he had begun treating access as proof of intelligence. If a door opened for him, he assumed he deserved the room behind it. He had been sitting in enough executive lunches and board dinners to believe fluency could be imitated through posture alone. The proposal he unveiled sounded polished from a distance. He wanted to consolidate 3 long-term suppliers into one strategic partnership with a newer vendor out of North Carolina that promised lower rates, cleaner reporting, and a more nimble growth mentality. Those were his words, nimble growth mentality. He said we were too dependent on legacy relationships. He said loyalty had made us sluggish. He said the company needed bolder external partners if it was going to compete in the next decade. If you stripped away the language, what he was really saying was simple. He wanted to gamble continuity for optics. The problem was not that new vendors were always bad. The problem was that this specific vendor had already crossed my desk 9 months earlier and been flagged for inconsistency. Their pricing looked attractive because they underquoted on the front end, then changed terms after dependency formed. Their quality control records were thin. Their delivery performance across weather-sensitive corridors was mediocre. Most importantly, they did not yet have the capacity to absorb the volume Julian wanted to hand them. I had rejected them once already. Julian either did not know that or did not care. I sat through the presentation in silence while he clicked through slides full of gradients and arrows and words like transformation and alignment. Around the table, some people nodded because the numbers on the screen looked elegant enough to suspend disbelief for half an hour. Others stayed very still, which in corporate settings is often the purest form of dissent people believe they can afford. At the end of the presentation, my father looked at me and asked whether I had any concerns. That question always irritated me, because by then he already knew the answer. Asking publicly was his way of making. My expertise appeared like one opinion among many rather than the reason we had survived his son's education in executive theater. I said yes. I said the proposed vendor had failed prior internal review. I said their capacity claims had not been stress-tested against our actual demand cycles. I said their margin advantage disappeared the moment expedited recovery freight became necessary, which it inevitably would if they missed windows during peak movement. I said consolidation only works when the surviving partner has proved stable enough to justify the concentration risk. Then I said, as calmly as I could, that replacing reliable infrastructure with attractive language is usually how avoidable disasters become case studies. Julian smiled, the way people smile when they think they can win by making maturity look boring. He said there is always resistance from people deeply invested in how things have always been done. He put special emphasis on always. My father gave a measured nod, as though both of us had raised equally valid philosophical possibilities. Then he approved a pilot program. Of course he did. Not full implementation. That would have been too reckless for even him to defend immediately. Just a pilot. One region, 2 categories of components, limited term. Enough to call it measured. Enough to fail smaller, which men like my father often believe makes failure less real. The pilot still touched enough volume to matter. After the meeting, I went back to my office, closed the door, and documented my objection in writing. Not emotional, not dramatic, specific. I summarized the prior review concerns, attached the older capacity notes, listed the operational risks, and requested that all implementation approvals for the pilot remain traceable through finance, procurement, and executive sign-off. I copied legal. I copied compliance. I copied my father. I copied Julian. Then I saved a copy to my personal file. That had become a ritual by then. Quiet record. Silent anchor. Julian responded 43 minutes later with a polished little paragraph thanking me for my diligence and saying risk-aware thinking was always valuable during periods of innovation. Periods of innovation. The phrase made my jaw tighten. He had a gift for writing like an article about leadership someone else had skimmed for him. For the first week, nothing went wrong. That was almost worse, because temporary calm is what emboldens the wrong people. Julian began walking around with a fresh layer of brightness in his face, stopping in departments he never used to visit, asking thin questions with theatrical concern. He started copying more people on more emails. He began referring to the pilot as one of our first major forward-leaning operational wins. Our. That word did a lot of work for him. By the second week, delays began to appear at the edges, not catastrophic ones. That is another thing people misunderstand about collapse. It rarely announces itself with a trumpet. It arrives through friction, tiny drags in places only the overworked notice first, a shipment that leaves 4 hours late, a line that waits 90 minutes for missing parts, a supervisor who marks something acceptable for now because production cannot stop again this quarter, a client who hears a promise twice and starts writing down who made it. I noticed the pattern immediately. The new vendor was hitting their early numbers only by splitting shipments oddly and leaning on a subcontracted carrier network they did not fully control. Half their loads were arriving incomplete. Their packaging integrity was inconsistent. One of their route planners was making assumptions about our receiving windows that would have been laughable if they had not been so expensive. I flagged it in a summary note to my father and Julian. I recommended pausing expansion until the pilot completed a full cycle. Julian replied first. He said temporary turbulence was common whenever outdated systems were challenged. That one almost made me laugh. Outdated systems, by which he meant the systems that had kept us solvent long enough for him to misdescribe them in conference rooms. My father did not reply at all. At the end of week 3, the vendor missed a Friday consolidation load that fed 3 downstream schedules. By Monday morning, Plant 1 was running short on 1 component family. Plant 3 had to reshuffle labor, and a client in Virginia was already asking why an expected shipment status had gone strangely quiet over the weekend. I fixed what I could, not because I wanted to protect Julian anymore, but because I was still protecting the people downstream of executive vanity, floor staff, dispatch teams, contract leads, ordinary employees whose paychecks did not deserve to become sacrifices to inheritance theater. That distinction mattered to me. People think stepping back from injustice means letting everything burn. Sometimes it just means choosing carefully who you are no longer willing to save. I stabilized the immediate exposure, documented every workaround cost, and sent a formal assessment to my father late that night. He called me into his office the next morning. He was standing when I entered, which usually meant he wanted height to do some of the work for him. He said my tone in the memo was unhelpful. I asked which part he meant. He said it conveyed a lack of support for the company's strategic direction. There it was again. The company's strategic direction, as if his son's vanity project had become collective destiny the moment he endorsed it. I said support and accuracy were not the same thing. He said no one was asking me to sacrifice accuracy. I said then perhaps he could explain why my accurate warnings kept being treated as disloyal whenever they complicated Julian's ambitions. He stared at me for a moment. Then he said I had become increasingly difficult. That sentence did not hit me the way it might once have. I had begun seeing the machinery too clearly by then. Difficult, emotional, bitter, resistant. Men like my father rarely argue with the content of your objection once they sense they cannot win there. They move quickly to your temperament. It is a simpler battlefield, easier to muddy, easier to sell. I told him the pilot should be paused. He said we would evaluate after the next board touchpoint. I asked whether he understood the cost of waiting. He said I had a habit of dramatizing temporary pain. Temporary pain. That phrase stayed with me all day. So much of my life with him had been built on that doctrine. Endure this, carry this, fix this, swallow this. It is temporary. Temporary disappointment, temporary unfairness, temporary insult, temporary invisibility. A decade later, you wake up and realize temporary was simply the respectful word he used for permanent, as long as it was happening to you. By the end of the month, the vendor pilot had become impossible to defend honestly. They missed key volume commitments. One batch arrived with documentation errors that forced a partial hold. 2 clients received revised timelines after internal promises had already gone out. Recovery freight costs erased the savings Julian had bragged about in slide 6. Arturo Vega sent me a terse note from Plant 1 that said, in effect, we were now spending money to buy uncertainty at premium speed. I compiled the numbers. Every delay, every premium shipment, every labor disruption, every margin hit, every written warning previously ignored. Then I sent the packet to my father before the next board meeting. He did not respond, but he changed the agenda. Julian's vendor initiative, once positioned as proof of his forward vision, became a brief subsection under broader market experimentation. The language softened instantly. No ownership, no excitement, no triumphant framing, just lessons learned during exploratory sourcing activity. I sat at the far end of the conference table and watched my father perform what he had always done best. He absorbed his favorite son's failure into abstraction. When I missed by an inch, it was character. When Julian failed in public, it became process. That was the pattern. It had always been the pattern. After the meeting, Julian cornered me in the hallway outside the executive wing. He asked if I enjoyed humiliating him. That question almost impressed me in its purity. The complete inability to distinguish between consequence and attack. I said I had reported facts. He said I could have framed them differently. I asked whether he meant inaccurately. He took a step closer. Not aggressive exactly, just entitled to proximity, the way men like him always were. He said I had wanted this to fail. I said wanting something and predicting it are not the same. Then I told him the truly remarkable part was how many times he had mistaken caution for sabotage, simply because caution required him to admit he was unprepared. He said I had spent my whole life resenting him. That one landed strangely, because there was a thin, twisted honesty inside it. Not in the way he meant. I did not resent him for existing. I resented the arrangement that let him float on praise while I sank under responsibility and was called blessed for being load-bearing. I resented the childhood mathematics of it, the adult extension of it. The way even now, after measurable failure, he still believed my accuracy was the indecent thing in the room. I said no. I said I had spent my whole life underestimating how much damage it could do when a man is raised to believe love and qualification are the same. He called me self-righteous. I told him at least one of us had earned a right to a point of view here. Then I walked away. That night, for the first time in years, I went to a bar alone. Not because I wanted noise, I wanted the opposite. A place full of strangers where nobody knew my surname. A low brick place downtown with bad lighting and bartenders who poured without conversation unless invited. I sat at the end, ordered bourbon I barely tasted, and watched a basketball game on mute over the bottles. At some point, a woman 2 stools down asked if the seat between us was taken. I said no. She thanked me, sat, and ordered red wine. We did not speak for 10 minutes. Then she glanced at the game, smiled faintly, and said she liked watching men in suits yell silently because it made sports seem more honest somehow. I laughed before I meant to. She turned fully then and studied me with that careful, unintrusive intelligence some people have. She looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger. Dark hair pinned loosely back, navy coat over a gray dress, tired eyes, but alert. The kind of face that suggested both discipline and humor, which I had always found more dangerous than beauty by itself. She asked if I was having a difficult week. I said I was having a difficult decade. That made her laugh. Her name was Leah Mercer. She was an employment attorney, which felt almost too precise to be believable, but life occasionally arranges irony with a heavy hand. We talked in fragments at first, work without detail, families without names. The sort of conversation strangers have when they each suspect the other is carrying a private bruise and neither wants to perform interest too quickly. Eventually, she asked what kind of work I did. I said, manufacturing operations. She winced playfully and said that sounded like the kind of job where everyone calls only when something is already on fire. I said yes. Then I added that my talent, apparently, was preventing fires that other people later took credit for never seeing. She turned her glass slowly between her fingers and said that sounded less like talent and more like a trap. Something in me stilled when she said that, not because it was profound, because it was accurate without ornament. A trap. We talked for almost an hour. I did not tell her the company name. I did not tell her my father's name, but I told her enough structure for her to understand the shape of it. Family business, older father, younger brother positioned publicly, me in the operational spine, A decade of responsibility without title parity, increasing efforts to edge me into permanent usefulness without real authority. She listened the way lawyers and trauma survivors sometimes do, with full attention and no decorative interruptions. When I finished, she asked only one question. She asked whether I had documents. I smiled despite myself. I said yes. She nodded as if that mattered more than emotion, which in some situations it does. Then she said something I would think about many times afterward. She said people like my father survive not because they are smarter than everyone else, but because they rely on two assumptions: that the loyal child will keep the secrets, and that the injured child will keep wanting love more than justice. She took the last sip of her wine, set down cash, and put on her coat. Before she left, she gave me her card. She said she was not telling me to do anything dramatic. She said maybe nothing legal would ever be necessary, but she told me to keep my records somewhere my family could not access. And she told me never to confuse patience with passivity if what I was really doing was waiting for permission to stop being used. Then she wished me good night and left. I sat there a long time after that. The bartender asked if I wanted another drink. I said no. I went home instead and moved copies of every file to a secure external drive and an encrypted cloud folder under a bland, forgettable name. I slept better that night than I had in months. Not because anything was solved, because I had finally done something that belonged entirely to me. The next escalation came from my father, and it was more deliberate. He announced a leadership retreat at a hotel on the Eastern Shore. 2 days. Executive team, board subset, outside facilitator, strategic planning sessions. Normally, those things were half theater and half calendar management, but this one carried sharper edges from the start. Julian was listed as one of the primary session leads. I was assigned a breakout on operational continuity and execution discipline. In other words, he would be future. I would be infrastructure. The first day was exactly what I expected. Bad coffee, climate-controlled optimism, laminated name cards, a consultant with perfect teeth saying things about organizational storytelling and adaptive transition. Julian thrived in that kind of environment because nothing in it required consequences. He spoke beautifully about possibility. He was always strongest in rooms where nobody could ask the factory floor a direct question. That evening, we had dinner in a private room overlooking the water. Candlelight on glass. Safe topics. Controlled laughter. At some point, Benton Hale asked Julian where he saw Sterling Industrial in 5 years. Julian gave a smooth answer about selective expansion, brand elevation, modernization, strategic capital, and family continuity. He talked for almost 4 minutes without saying anything that would help a shipping coordinator on a Thursday. Then Benton turned to me and asked, almost casually, what I thought the greatest risk to the business was. I knew better than to answer emotionally, so I told the truth. I said concentration of authority in untested hands is always dangerous in operational businesses because consequences arrive physically, not philosophically. Orders fail, lines stop, clients leave, regulators notice. I said this company had succeeded for decades because real knowledge sat close enough to real decisions. Then I said any succession plan that separated image from competence would eventually make the market do the correction governance had refused to do first. You could feel the room change. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Julian looked at his plate for a second too long. My father set down his fork very carefully. The consultant smiled in the anxious way people do when they realize the family dynamics at the center of a contract are not theoretical. Benton said that was a strong point. My father said every transition involves differing management styles, and that robust debate was healthy inside ambitious families. There it was again, his talent for turning a wound into a panel discussion. After dinner, he asked me to walk with him outside. The air smelled like salt and wet wood. Boats shifted softly in the marina. Light from the hotel windows stretched across the dark water in broken gold lines. My father put his hands in his coat pockets and walked slowly, the way he did when he wanted to perform calm as if it were wisdom. He said I had embarrassed him. I said Benton had asked a direct question. He said there were ways to answer direct questions without undercutting one's own family in front of stakeholders. I asked whether he meant lying. He said he meant showing judgment. I said judgment would have required him to test Julian before displaying him. That did it. He stopped walking. He said, with a kind of exhausted contempt that almost sounded honest, that I had never understood legacy. I asked him to explain it then. He said legacy is not built only on competence. It requires someone people want to follow, someone who can represent continuity, someone who embodies the family's name in a way that invites confidence. I looked at him under the marina lights and realized something I should have understood years earlier. He did not see the company as a system of obligations. He saw it as a stage for lineage. Competence, in his mind, was labor. Inheritance was theater. Julian looked like the part. I made the part possible. That was enough for him. I asked whether he had ever once considered that I might have represented the family with confidence if he had not spent my entire life assigning me the burden while teaching everyone else where to look for glory. He said that was self-pity. I said no. It was architecture. He did not like that word, maybe because it made clear this was no longer about feelings. It was about design, about the repeated arrangement of advantage and invisibility until the resulting structure looked natural to everyone living inside it. He said I was in danger of making myself irrelevant. That sentence should have frightened me. Instead, I heard freedom in it. Because relevance, as he defined it, had always meant usefulness on humiliating terms. I said perhaps I was finally considering whether irrelevance to his design might be the first honest thing I had done in years. He stared at me. Then he said if I walked away from Sterling Industrial, I would be walking away from my birthright. I almost smiled. Because that was the first time he had ever used the word as if it applied to me. Only when he thought he might lose my labor did he briefly remember I was his son. I asked him what birthright he meant. The one where I held the company together while my brother rehearsed inheritance in public. The one where I cleaned every operational wound but got called bitter when I noticed the pattern. The one where my value existed only as long as I remained willing to disappear behind Julian's name. He said I was twisting everything. I said no. I was stripping it. We stood there in silence after that, with the cold wind off the water and the boats knocking gently against their slips. Finally, he said something so quiet I almost missed it. He said, "Not everyone is meant to lead from the front." There it was, the creed beneath all the polished language. Not everyone is meant to lead from the front. I looked at him and thought, "No, Father. You made sure of that." I did not say it. I simply told him good night and walked back into the hotel without waiting for him. The next morning, Julian gave a presentation on future-facing leadership frameworks. By lunchtime, 2 people had privately asked me if I was really leaving the company. That was how I learned rumors were already moving. He and my father were preparing the narrative. Not Daniel has been carrying this place for years and finally refuses to keep doing it without dignity. No, it would be Daniel is tired. Daniel has become difficult. Daniel may be burned out. Daniel prefers the back end. Daniel was never truly interested in the public burden of leadership. Daniel is invaluable but perhaps not suited for transition. Always the same trick. Turn your deprivation into preference. Turn your endurance into temperament. Turn your exclusion into evidence that you belonged there all along. By the time we got back from the retreat, I understood the next phase had begun. They were not just trying to sideline me functionally. They were trying to narrate me out of legitimacy. So I adjusted. I stopped volunteering rescue before being asked. I stopped rewriting Julian's external remarks. I stopped softening his errors in mixed company. I stopped staying late to fix things that existed only because he had overridden experienced advice earlier in the day. When I did intervene, I documented why. When I warned, I sent it in writing. When I was excluded, I saved the proof. When someone tried to assign me invisible repair work without corresponding authority, I asked for a formal scope in email. The company noticed before the family did. Not because I became reckless, because I became measurable. Invisible labor creates comfort precisely because nobody tracks the alternative. The moment you attach names, timestamps, and decision trails to dysfunction, people start realizing how much silence used to save them. Arturo noticed. Finance noticed. Compliance noticed. Even HR, that eternal graveyard of moral courage, began asking more careful questions around structural responsibilities and reporting lines. Julian noticed last, but he noticed loudest. One afternoon, he burst into my office without knocking, holding a printout of an email thread in which I had declined to approve an expedited vendor exception he had verbally promised to a client. He asked what game I thought I was playing. I said no game. The request violated our documented approval pathway and exposed us to chargeback risk if the load missed its revised window. He said he had already assured the client. I said then he had assured them irresponsibly. He threw the paper onto my desk. He said I was trying to make him look incompetent. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said the most dangerous people in business are often the ones who believe exposure creates incompetence rather than revealing it. His face went red. He told me I had always needed to feel superior. That accusation almost fascinated me. Superiority was the one luxury I had never been allowed. Precision, yes. Responsibility, yes. Exhaustion, certainly. But superiority belonged to the favored, the crowned, the ones praised into confidence before consequence arrived. I told him he was confusing superiority with the presence of earned knowledge. He said Father was right about me. I asked what Father was right about. He said that no matter how much the company gave me, I would always be angry it was not enough. There are moments when another person accidentally says the truest thing available, even while intending insult, because he was right about one part. It was not enough. Not the salary, not the praise without power, not the reliance without respect, not the endless invitation to disappear behind someone less capable and call that loyalty. No, it was not enough. I stood. He took a step back without meaning to. Then I said, very evenly, that what had been given to me was work. What had been withheld was inheritance, authority, and dignity. I said those are not the same category, no matter how often privileged people try to package them together. He stared at me like he had never really seen me before. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe I had made the mistake of being too useful for too long. People stop imagining depth in the person carrying the structure. They see function, stability, reliability. They forget there is a mind inside the machinery taking notes. He said this was not over. I said I knew. Then I picked up the paper from my desk, handed it back to him, and told him if he wanted operational discretion, he could start by learning the operational consequences of his own promises. He left without another word. That night I got home to find a package by my front door, no return label. Inside was a thin, leather-bound notebook I recognized instantly. My mother's handwriting was on the first page. I sat down right there on the floor before I opened it fully. For a minute I just looked at her name, written in blue ink that had faded slightly with time. Evelyn Sterling. I had not seen that handwriting in years. The notebook had come from Marianne. There was a small card tucked inside. It said only, "I thought this belonged to you now." I do not know why she chose that moment. Guilt, perhaps. Clarity. Fear. Or maybe she had spent years surviving her own version of my father and recognized, too late to be brave but not too late to be human, that something in his design for me had gone too far. The notebook was not a diary exactly, more a series of notes. Household observations, fragments, lists, a few thoughts on my childhood, small memories of me at 4, 5, 6, and then deeper in, entries from the period when she was already ill. One line stopped me cold. Daniel notices everything and apologizes for things he did not break. I read that sentence 3 times. Then another. His father admires strength most when it serves him. And another, written shakier than the earlier ones. If I am gone, I hope no one teaches my son that love must be earned through usefulness. I closed the notebook and sat very still. Grief is a strange thing when it arrives through recognition instead of loss. My mother had been dead for decades, but in that moment she became newly real to me because she had seen it. Even then, before the company, before Julian grew into my father's chosen reflection, before I had words for architecture and patterns and structural humiliation, she had seen it, which meant I had not imagined my life, not exaggerated it, not become too sensitive with age, not drifted into resentment out of professional fatigue. She had seen the shape of the trap when I was still a child. I slept with the notebook on the bedside table. The next morning I made a decision. Not a loud one, not irreversible yet, but real. I contacted Leah Mercer and asked if she had time to meet. Her office was downtown on the 14th floor of a building that smelled faintly of toner and polished stone, clean lines, muted art, a receptionist who spoke softly but efficiently. Leah greeted me herself and led me into a conference room with glass walls overlooking the harbor. She did not waste time with unnecessary sympathy. She asked what had changed. I told her the company was preparing a narrative that positioned me as unstable, obstructive, or unsuited for visible leadership. I told her I had years of records showing a pattern of responsibility without title parity, recent efforts to funnel authority to my younger brother, despite measurable incompetence and an increasing tendency by my father to frame documented objections as emotional unreliability. She listened, then asked the question that mattered. She asked what outcome I wanted. I had not thought about it cleanly enough until then. I told her I did not want to spend another decade keeping a machine alive for people who required my diminishment as the price of entry. I told her I wanted to leave on terms that could not be rewritten into family folklore. I wanted my record preserved, my role acknowledged, my leverage recognized before they tried to turn me into an anecdote about burnout. She nodded. Then she said we were not dealing with a fairy tale, so what mattered was pressure, documentation, and timing. She reviewed some of what I had brought. Emails, memos, organizational charts, compensation history, evidence of me carrying executive-level operational authority without equivalent title or succession consideration. Recent language from my father implying instability. Proof of Julian receiving high-level authority despite repeated failures and repeated rescue by teams reporting through me. Leah did not overreact. That calmed me more than outrage would have. She said the material did not necessarily point to one dramatic legal claim that would instantly crush them, especially because family businesses muddy motives with tradition and informal power structures all the time. But she said something else mattered just as much. Narrative risk. If my father forced me out badly, the company could face fallout not only from any legal questions, but from lender confidence, board scrutiny, retention risk among senior operators, and discovery of how much undocumented dependence had actually been sitting in one son while they marketed the other as inevitable. She said men like my father often believe they can control family. What they fear is markets. Then she asked whether my departure, if it came, would hurt them operationally. I almost laughed. I said yes. Then she laid out the contours of what leverage might look like. No threats without preparation. No dramatic resignation speech unless strategically necessary. No angry email. No hallway outburst. Instead, preserve evidence, define responsibilities, clarify in writing where knowledge concentration exists, and if the time came, negotiate separation from a position of documented indispensability and reputational risk. She said something else then that mattered even more. She said I needed to decide whether I was still trying to be loved by these people, because if I was, negotiation would fail before it began. I did not answer right away. Finally, I said, I did not think love was available in the form I had been chasing. She nodded like someone hearing a client say the only sentence that makes the rest of the work possible. When I left her office, I walked the harbor for nearly an hour. The water was gray, the wind was sharp. Tourists moved in bright jackets between restaurants and shops. A street musician was playing violin under an overhang, badly but with conviction. I thought about my mother's notebook, my father's marina sentence, Julian's certainty, my own years of obedience laid end to end like track, and for the first time, the future did not look like a hallway I was trapped inside. It looked expensive, complicated, possibly brutal, but open. The board began to understand the truth the same way most powerful people do, not through conscience, through inconvenience. For years, I had been the hidden mechanism inside Sterling Industrial. That arrangement worked beautifully for everyone except me because competence was being delivered without forcing anybody to acknowledge where it lived. I solved crises before they reached the level of board discomfort. I corrected Julian's mistakes before they matured into reportable problems. I translated plant-level reality into executive language smooth enough for lenders, auditors, and directors to digest without indigestion. Once I stopped doing that invisibly, the company became harder to misunderstand. It started with little things. Benton Hale requested a deeper breakdown of plant variance after noticing 2 quarters of temporary operational turbulence kept appearing in polished summaries without matching narrative urgency. A second board member asked finance why premium freight costs were climbing if the vendor modernization initiative had been folded back months earlier. Compliance wanted clarification on reporting lines after receiving conflicting directives from Julian and the operations office. One of our lenders asked for a more detailed continuity overview during a routine covenant call, and for the first time in years, my father could not answer half the questions without glancing toward me. That was new, not the glancing. He had always needed me in rooms like that. What changed was the visibility of the need. In the past, he would consult me, then resume the performance of command. Lately, the pauses were longer. The missing details were more obvious. Too many of the systems investors cared about existed in my head, in my notes, in routines built through years of hands-on correction that Julian had never bothered to learn, and my father had never bothered to value because he mistook continuity for something ornamental. One Thursday morning, we had a call with a regional banking partner to discuss equipment financing tied to a planned expansion at Plant 3. It should have been simple. Numbers were strong enough. Timing was manageable. The problem came when the banker, a precise woman named Elaine Foster, who had a habit of asking only 2 or 3 questions but making each of them uncomfortably exact, asked what management redundancy existed in operations if leadership transitioned over the next 18 months. My father gave one of his broad answers about team depth and family alignment. Elaine let him finish. Then she asked who specifically held cross-plant continuity knowledge around supply sequencing, labor balancing, emergency vendor substitution, and regulatory timing exposure. There was a pause. My father said our operational culture was extremely collaborative. Elaine asked again, who specifically? This time he looked at me, not subtly, directly. I answered because silence would have harmed the company more than him, and there were still lines I was unwilling to cross for innocent people caught inside his structure. I explained how continuity actually functioned, the layered dependencies, the undocumented exceptions, the transition risks, the time it would take to responsibly redistribute real institutional knowledge if leadership changed faster in title than in practice. Elaine thanked me. Then she asked whether a formal continuity plan had been documented and approved by the board. Another pause. No, it had not. After the call, my father asked me to stay behind in the conference room. Julian stayed too, though no one invited him. My father shut the door and stood at the head of the table with both hands resting on the polished wood. He always did that when he wanted gravity to seem like authority rather than pressure. He said I had overcomplicated a routine financing conversation. I asked which part was inaccurate. He said accuracy was not the point. There it was again. Accuracy was not the point. So many of the ugliest family systems can be summarized by that sentence, not because facts are absent, but because facts are poorly behaved. Facts do not protect image. Facts do not honor hierarchy. Facts do not care who was promised the crown in childhood. I said financiers cared about concentration risk. He said financiers cared about confidence. I said false confidence becomes expensive faster than honest dependency. Julian cut in then and said I had a remarkable gift for making every room more negative. That word. Negative. As if gravity were negativity. As if warning a man there is no floor beneath his next step were simply poor attitude. I turned to him and said, some rooms deserve discomfort if discomfort is the only thing preventing collapse from being. Rebranded as optimism. My father told me to stop. Then he did something he rarely did in business settings. He made it personal too soon. He said maybe the larger issue was that I had become unable to celebrate anyone else's role because I had spent too long imagining the company owed me something more than a career. I remember looking at him and feeling, not rage exactly, but exhaustion refined into clarity. He still thought this was envy. After everything, after the years, after the sacrifice, after the measurable imbalance, after the repeated rescue of his favorite child from consequences. He still preferred the simpler lie. I said the company did owe me something more than a career if it had spent 10 years extracting executive labor while publicly reserving inheritance for someone less qualified. I said there are words for that in every industry, and none of them are gratitude. Julian asked if I was threatening legal action. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because fear had finally reached him before understanding did. I said I was describing a pattern. If the pattern frightened him, perhaps he should consider why. My father's face changed then. He became very still, which was always more dangerous than yelling. He said we would continue this privately. I said that was where most of the damage had happened, so I preferred clarity in professional settings whenever possible. Then I left the room. That afternoon, I got 3 separate messages from senior staff asking versions of the same question. Was everything okay at the top? I did not answer directly. I had no intention of making myself the gossip vector inside a company already unsteady enough. But the question itself mattered. People were noticing. The polished surface was beginning to reflect strain instead of hiding it. 2 days later, my father made his first real move against me. It arrived as a memo from HR. A leadership realignment, effective immediately. The document was dressed in the usual soft language, role optimization, reporting clarity, future-ready structure. But the substance was clear. Several departments that had long coordinated through me would now have dotted line reporting into Julian's office on all strategic transformation matters. External stakeholder coordination for operations adjacent initiatives would now be filtered through him. Client-facing updates on modernization, expansion, and executive transition would route through his desk first. In practical terms, it was an attempt to separate me from visibility while leaving me responsible for outcomes. Classic. If things worked, Julian would be associated with progress. If things broke, I would still be close enough to absorb blame. I read the memo twice, then once more. Not because I did not understand it, because I did. Then I forwarded it to my personal account, saved a copy to my file, and walked down to Arturo Vega's office at Plant 1 via video link. He took one look at my face and asked what they had done. I summarized. He rubbed a hand over his mouth and stared at the desk. Then he said something I had heard in other forms for years, but never with quite that level of stripped-down honesty. He said they were trying to keep my hands on the machine while moving my name away from the controls. Exactly. That same day, I scheduled a private meeting with finance, compliance, and procurement leads, not to rebel, not to grandstand, but to clarify operational reality. I told them the new structure increased decision fragmentation risk. I told them I would continue carrying my formal responsibilities exactly as assigned, but I also said that any requests crossing authority lines, especially those involving client commitments, vendor exceptions, regulatory deadlines, or labor reallocation, needed written traceability. No more verbal reshuffling, no more Daniel will sort it out after someone else had promised what they had no right to promise. They all understood immediately, because competent people know exactly what a power grab looks like when it comes wrapped in organizational vocabulary. That week, my father hosted a dinner at his house for a board subset and 2 outside advisors. I was not originally invited. Something had changed in her by then, whether it was guilt, fear, or the first honest disgust she had allowed herself to feel. I could not tell, but I could hear the strain of it even before she spoke. Then, late that afternoon, Mary Ann called. Not texted, called. She asked whether I was coming to dinner. I said I had not been asked. There was a pause. Then she said, "I think you should come." No explanation, no softness, just that. So I went. The dining room was lit like a magazine spread, all candlelight and polished silver and too many flowers trying to make strategy seem domestic. My father sat at one end of the table, Julian 2 seats down, Bent and Hale opposite, 2 advisors from a consulting firm on the far side, Mary Ann composed as ever, and me placed midway along the left side, like a compromise someone had not wanted to make too obvious. The conversation began harmlessly enough. Regional manufacturing headwinds, election uncertainty, capital strategy, labor market discipline, the usual upper-class ritual of turning ordinary economic anxiety into a language game. Then one of the consultants asked how Sterling Industrial intended to balance family continuity with management modernization. There was that phrase again. Family continuity. I wondered briefly how many expensive men had gotten rich by inventing neutral-sounding labels for inherited unfairness. My father answered beautifully. Of course he did. He spoke of values, institutional memory, generational stewardship, complementary leadership styles between his sons. He described Julian as the public-facing future and me as the essential operational anchor. Anchor. Another lovely word for the son who is meant to stay weighted while someone else sails. The consultant seemed impressed. Benton looked thoughtful. Then Mary Ann did something I had not expected from her in all the years I had known her. She interrupted. Not dramatically, just enough. She said very calmly that Daniel had been running the company's real moving parts for years, and any discussion of continuity that treated that as secondary was unserious. Silence took the table. I did not move. Julian gave a short laugh, the reflexive kind people use when they want to signal that something awkward is exaggerated rather than threatening. My father turned his head slowly toward Mary Ann. He asked what she meant. She set down her wine glass. Then she said she meant exactly what she had said. That succession theater was not the same as succession planning. That public charm did not move freight, manage exposure, retain supervisors, or hold together vendor networks through labor shortages and supply shocks. She said everyone at that table was smart enough to know who had actually been carrying Sterling Industrial, and pretending otherwise for the sake of family aesthetics was not leadership. I think that was the first time in my life I saw my father genuinely unbalanced in a room full of peers. He was not loud. He was offended down to the bone. He said this was neither the time nor the place for emotional family commentary. Mary Ann replied with astonishing steadiness that truth was not emotional simply because it made him uncomfortable. It is hard to describe what that did to me. Not healing. Not exactly. But there is a peculiar shock in hearing someone finally name aloud the thing you have been forced to live around in silence. It does not fix the years. It does not restore what was denied. But it breaks the illusion that the injustice was invisible. The consultant stared into his water like a man wishing himself professionally elsewhere. Benton cleared his throat. One of the advisors asked cautiously whether a formal leadership redundancy and authority map had been reviewed recently by the board. My father said it was in progress. I said, before I could decide not to, that no such map had been formally approved. My father looked at me with the kind of contained hatred only fathers can summon without raising their voices. Dinner stumbled on after that, but the evening was ruined in the useful sense. The shape of the lie had been disturbed. It would not settle back into elegance as cleanly as before. When dessert came, I excused myself early. Mary Ann followed me into the front hall while I was putting on my coat. She did not apologize. I respected that. Instead, she said she should have said it years ago. I looked at her. She looked older than usual, not physically, but morally, as if she had finally gotten tired of holding her spine in a position that pleased someone else. I asked why she had not. She answered with more honesty than I expected. She said because survival inside a marriage like hers teaches you the cost of precision. Because when one child is favored long enough, everyone around the family begins organizing themselves around the weather of that preference. Because she had mistaken maintaining peace for preventing harm, and because, by the time she understood what that silence was costing me, silence had already become one of the habits keeping her own life manageable. That was the closest thing to confession I think she was capable of. I nodded. Then she said my mother would have hated all of this. That almost undid me. I asked how she knew. She said because Evelyn noticed everything. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and handed me a folded document. Not original, a photocopy. She said she thought I might need it someday. I waited until I got to my car before I opened it. It was an old organizational draft from 12 years earlier. Internal, preliminary, clearly never meant for wide circulation. A succession discussion memo. My father had marked it by hand in blue ink. I recognized the handwriting instantly. There were 3 columns: leadership readiness, public perception, family narrative. Under my name, in the first column, he had written, strongest operational candidate by far. Under public perception, too severe, insufficient warmth. Under family narrative, cannot center him without complicating legacy line. Under Julian's name, high visibility upside, trainable weaknesses, more natural fit for family continuation. I sat in my car with the dome light on and that photocopy in my hands for a very long time. Cannot center him without complicating legacy line. There it was. The sentence beneath all the years. Not about merit, not about temperament, not about readiness, not even truly about love. Narrative. I was not the chosen son because choosing me would have interfered with the story my father wanted his life to tell. The company, the marriage, the polished society dinners, the charitable boards, the handsome younger heir standing where donors and bankers expected him, the right wife, the right child, the right line continuing in the right shape. And me? I was the proof of older complexity. Useful, capable, inconvenient. I laughed once in the car, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief becoming final. Then I scanned the document the moment I got home and sent a copy to Leah Mercer with the subject line, "You were right about narrative risk." She called me the next morning. She did not waste time. She said the document mattered, especially combined with everything else, because it showed deliberate thinking around sidelining the most qualified leadership candidate for reasons tied to image and family presentation. Maybe not a dramatic courtroom thunderbolt by itself, but highly relevant in negotiation, board pressure, and any argument about pretext if they tried to reframe me as suddenly unsuitable after years of reliance. Then she asked whether I was ready to stop thinking like a son and start thinking like a stakeholder. I told her I was getting there. She said getting there was not enough anymore, because my father had made his counterplay. And she was right. By Monday, the company rumor cycle had shifted into a new register. Not just Daniel and Julian have different styles. Not just family transition is complicated. Now there were whispers that I might be taking a step back for personal reasons, that I had grown resistant to change, that I was brilliant but perhaps too rigid for the next phase. All of it vague enough to deny. All of it specific enough to shape perception. All of it cowardly in the exact way strategic defamation often is inside family businesses. I did not confront it publicly. Instead, I became even cleaner. Every meeting documented, every scope clarified, every directive confirmed, every exposure noted, every instance of being assigned responsibility without corresponding authority captured. And then the company got hit with the kind of problem image cannot solve. A Tuesday morning systems outage at our largest distribution partner intersected with a delayed inbound materials load and a labor shortfall at Plant 3. On its own, each problem was manageable. Together, they created a cascading risk across outbound schedules for 3 major clients. Normally, I would have moved instantly, stitching departments together before most executives finished their second coffee. Instead, I followed the new structure. I contacted the appropriate leads. I flagged the exposures. I requested executive alignment because client communication now routed through Julian's office on transformation-adjacent matters. And then I waited, not passively, professionally. Julian took 92 minutes to respond. In those 92 minutes, a client escalation moved from yellow to red. Plant supervisors began improvising around missing commitments, and finance started asking whether recovery freight would be required. When Julian finally joined the call, he wasted the first 10 minutes trying to understand what had already become urgent. I watched the room realizing it in real time. The questions came harder. Who approved this customer messaging? Why was distribution not pre-briefed? Who has final decision authority? Why are operations waiting on communications sign-off? Why is there no clear override path? Julian answered badly. My father tried to smooth over the confusion. I answered only when asked directly, and when I did, I was exact. I explained where the bottleneck existed. I explained why the new reporting architecture had introduced delay. I explained what would now be required to prevent missed deliveries. I explained that the issue was recoverable, but only if authority became practical instead of decorative immediately. No heat, no flourish, just anatomy. By late afternoon, the crisis was contained, but something important had changed. Not the problem. The witnesses. Finance had seen it. Compliance had seen it. A lender liaison had seen enough to ask follow-up questions. 2 board members received a same-day summary. And most dangerously for my father, the company had seen who the room waited for once performance language failed, and consequence showed up in steel-toed boots. That evening, Benton Hale asked for a private meeting with both my father and me the following day. Not Julian. Just us. When I arrived, Benton was already seated in the smaller boardroom off the executive corridor. No assistants, no consultant, no lunch service. Just coffee, a notepad, and the look of a man old enough to have stopped pretending he did not understand what he understood. My father came in 2 minutes later, controlled but tight around the eyes. Benton gestured for us to sit. Then he said he wanted a candid conversation about continuity risk. My father began with the usual language: strategic evolution, learning process, temporary friction, complementary strengths. Benton let him speak. Then he turned to me and asked how long Sterling Industrial could operate safely if I left with 30 days' notice. I answered honestly. Not well. It could continue. Of course it could continue. No person is literally irreplaceable, and I had no interest in dramatics that insulted ordinary truth. But safely, cleanly, without measurable disruption, lost confidence, cultural damage, exposure on client trust, and a likely shedding of high-value internal talent? No. Not in 30 days. Not even close. Benton looked at my father. Then he asked the question my father had spent years avoiding. He asked why the board had never formalized an authority structure that reflected actual operational dependence. My father said he had always intended to. Benton asked why he had not. Another pause. My father said family considerations made sequencing delicate. Benton's expression did not change, but his voice did. It became flatter, older, less patient. He said, delicacy is an indulgence boards can afford only when continuity is real. Then he said almost gently that the market would not care which son was easier to photograph. That sentence might have been the first true act of loyalty anyone had shown me inside Sterling Industrial in a decade, and Benton probably did not even mean it that way. He meant loyalty to the company. But truth has a way of helping the wounded even when it arrives for other reasons. My father said this was becoming adversarial. Benton said it was becoming visible. Then he stood, closed his notebook, and said he expected a formal continuity review, role authority map, and succession risk briefing within 10 days. As he left, he put one hand briefly on my shoulder. Not intimate, not paternal, just steady. Then I was alone in the boardroom with my father. He stayed seated for several seconds after the door shut. I could feel the anger in him like heat off metal. Finally, he looked up and said, I had orchestrated this. I almost laughed, not because it was absurd, because it was inevitable. Men like my father cannot distinguish between reality arriving and betrayal arranging it. I said no. He had orchestrated it years ago when he built the company's future around denial and called it legacy. He stood then. He said if I wanted war, I should understand exactly who I was making an enemy of. That did not scare me the way it once would have. Maybe because some threats lose force the moment you realize you have already lived under them most of your life. I told him I did not want war. I wanted acknowledgement, structure, and terms that reflected the truth of what had been extracted from me. He said I had become mercenary. I said perhaps that was what a son begins to look like after he stops offering devotion at a family discount. We stood there facing each other in the cold light of that little boardroom, father and son with a company between us like a body one of us loved for image and one of us had kept alive by hand. Then he said the ugliest thing he had said to me yet, and maybe the truest. He said I was only in this position because he had allowed it. Allowed it. That word turned something final inside me. Allowed me to work. Allowed me to save him. Allowed me to become indispensable. Allowed me to confuse access with respect. Allowed me to survive inside his design as long as I accepted my assigned shape. I looked at him and, with a calm I did not feel until I heard it in my own voice, said no. I said I was in this position because every time he needed competence, he reached for me. Every time he needed sacrifice, he expected me. Every time the company was at risk, it was my judgment, not Julian's charm, that kept his name clean. I said what he had allowed was not my success. What he had allowed was his own dependence. He went pale in a way I had never seen before. Because he knew it was true. Truth becomes dangerous not when it is spoken, but when the powerful hear themselves in it. My father tried to buy my silence 3 days later, not with cash at first, with dignity, which was somehow more insulting because it meant he still believed he controlled the distribution of it. He sent me a message just before noon. Dinner tonight, my club, private room, come alone, no greeting, no context, no please. By then I had stopped reading his brevity as strength. It was not strength, it was habit. The language of a man who had spent so many years summoning people that he had forgotten requests were supposed to recognize another person's will. I went anyway. Not because he deserved the courtesy, because I wanted to see what fear looked like on him when it had time to put on a jacket and order wine. The club was one of those old Baltimore institutions where wealth goes to reassure itself it has texture. Dark wood, muted carpets, portraits of dead benefactors with stern, benevolent faces, men speaking softly about markets and schools and shoreline property as if the rest of the world were a rumor that might pass if ignored long enough. The private dining room sat at the end of a corridor lined with framed regatta photos. My father was already seated when I entered. No drink yet. That told me more than his expression did. He stood when I came in, which he rarely did for me. That told me even more. He asked whether I wanted anything. I said no. We sat. For a while, neither of us spoke. The waiter poured water and withdrew with the kind of silent precision only very expensive rooms train into people. Then my father folded his hands on the table and said he wanted to reset the tone between us. Tone. Always tone. As if the structure of injustice could be solved by reupholstering the atmosphere. I said he should say what he called me there to say. He watched me for a moment, maybe weighing whether directness would cost him too much dignity. Then he began. He said the board's concern had accelerated conversations that were better handled privately. He said public friction between family members created unnecessary risk. He said the company needed stability, not emotional escalation. He said he was prepared to make sure my contributions were recognized appropriately going forward. Recognized appropriately, another careful phrase, soft enough to sound generous, empty enough to hold anything. I asked what that meant. He leaned back slightly, as if now that the opening had been crossed, he could return to the confidence of a man arranging furniture rather than pleading. He said he was prepared to formalize a substantial compensation adjustment, an expanded title, and a written retention package tied to transition support over the next 3 years. He said I would be publicly acknowledged as Chief Operating Officer. He said there would be equity participation. He said my role would be described as essential to continuity. He said if I handled the next phase responsibly, all of us could move forward without unnecessary damage. There it was. Not apology, not correction, not inheritance, not truth. A premium salary for better camouflage. I almost admired the shape of it. He was not offering me justice. He was offering a prettier cage. I asked whether Julian would still be publicly positioned as successor. He did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. Then he said the family's external continuity plan remained important. External continuity plan. Such elegant language for a lie people in tailored suits intend to keep telling. I asked whether the board would be told that I had been the strongest operational candidate by far for over a decade and deliberately kept from central succession because I complicated his preferred family narrative. He looked at me sharply then. So Marianne had not told him what she had given me. Or if she had, he had hoped I would be too cautious to use it. He asked where I had heard that phrase. I said it did not matter. He said it mattered to him. I told him that was the first sincere thing he had said all evening. His jaw tightened. He said internal notes taken out of context prove nothing. I said context was the one thing I had in abundance. The waiter came in with menus. My father waved him away without looking up. When the door shut again, he lowered his voice. He said if I wanted to destroy the family, I should at least have the honesty to say so. Destroy the family. That accusation has always fascinated me because it is so often used by the person who built the damage and is merely offended that someone else refuses to keep decorating over the cracks. I said no. What I wanted was for him to stop using family as the moral shield around decisions driven by vanity. He said I was simplifying things I did not fully understand. That almost made me laugh. 10 years in the spine of his company, a lifetime in the weather of his preference, an archive of choices so consistent they practically formed a doctrine. And still he believed mystery might save him where facts could not. I told him the problem was not that I misunderstood. The problem was that I understood at last without needing him to explain it into elegance. His face changed then, not anger, weariness, not real remorse, but something adjacent to exposure. The fatigue of a man discovering that his most reliable arrangement has finally developed language. He said more quietly that leadership sometimes requires decisions not everyone will like. I said this was not leadership. It was curation. He had curated his family until it fit the story he wanted peers to admire. Julian as natural continuation, me as essential but secondary force, Mary Ann as polished stability. His dead first wife filed away into respectful silence. Every complication softened, every rough edge converted into posture. I said companies can sometimes survive that kind of vanity for years. Children do not. For the first time in that conversation, he looked away from me, toward the window, toward the dark lawn beyond the club, toward anything that was not the sun at the table refusing to hold the old shape. Then he said the one thing that nearly caught me. He said I had never made it easy. Not because it was true in the way he meant, because hidden inside it was the closest he would probably ever come to confession. I had never made it easy to forget what I was capable of, never made it easy to fully believe his own myth of Julian as inevitable, never made it easy to ignore the evidence of his dependence, never made it easy for his conscience, if he had one in matters like this, to settle comfortably. He said I was always intense, always observant, always difficult to place. He said people trusted competence, yes, but they followed warmth. He said Julian had something instinctive with people that mattered in ways I dismissed too easily. There it was again, my alleged lack, his chosen explanation for why I could run the business but never be invited to visibly belong to it. I asked him a simple question. I asked whether warmth without competence was safer than competence without theatrical ease. He said that was not fair. I said exactly. Nothing about this was fair, and yet somehow fairness only became a concern when I named the imbalance rather than when I lived under it. Then I told him no, not loudly, not dramatically, just no. No to the retention package. No to the polished title designed to make my subordination look like prestige. No to more money as compensation for continued erasure. No to helping him preserve the same inheritance, lie in better legal language. He stared at me as if he had still not truly believed refusal was possible. Then he asked what I wanted. This time I answered cleanly. I said I wanted one of two things. Either a real structural correction, actual authority, actual succession parity, actual public acknowledgement of where the company's continuity had lived, or a negotiated departure on terms that reflected my operational value, my years of executive labor, the risk concentration they had created, and the reputational exposure of trying to rewrite me after relying on me. He said that sounded like extortion. I said no. It sounded like a bill. He stood then, slowly, and went to the window with his back to me. His reflection floated faintly in the glass over the lawn outside. Older than he liked to admit. Narrower in the shoulders than I remembered from childhood. A man who had built power around posture now confronting a problem posture could not solve. Without turning around, he asked whether Leah Mercer had put those words in my mouth. Interesting. That he knew her name. Or maybe not interesting. Predictable. Men like my father keep track of threats the moment those threats acquire legal stationery. I said Leah had helped me think clearly. Yes. He nodded once, still facing the window. Then he said lawyers are very good at making families forget they are families. I stood, took my coat off the chair, and told him families are very good at making one person carry injustice until a lawyer finally gives it nouns. Then I left him there. Julian called me before I reached my car. His name on my screen looked almost absurd in that moment. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. He did not bother with pleasantries. He asked what I thought I was doing. I said driving home. He said father told him enough to understand I was being reckless. Reckless. Another favorite family word for any movement toward boundary. I said then he understood more tonight than he had in years. He said I was about to blow up everything over pride. I got into my car and closed the door before answering. Then I said no. What was blowing up was the arrangement that let him confuse being preferred with being prepared. He swore softly, not at me exactly, more at the world for refusing to stay upholstered. Then he said something new. He said he had not asked for any of this. I sat very still with the phone at my ear, because that, finally, was true. Not innocent, not exculpatory, but true. He had not designed the architecture. He had benefited from it greedily, yes. Defended it when it favored him, yes. Worn it like destiny, yes. But he had not built it. Our father had. And part of what made Julian so infuriating was that he wanted all the rewards of the structure without being held morally responsible for ever consenting to it. I asked whether he had ever once refused it. Silence. I asked whether he had ever stepped back and said Daniel built this place. Daniel should lead it. Daniel should not be carrying what I am being crowned for. More silence. Then he said, "Life does not work that way." I almost laughed. No. It had not worked that way because it had worked his way. I told him there comes a point when accepting unearned inheritance stops being passivity and becomes character. He said I always had to make everything into a moral drama. I said only when other people try to rename theft as tradition. He hung up on me. That night I barely slept, but not from anxiety. From motion. Thought moving too fast, too clean. The story was narrowing. After years of blur, the lines were becoming almost simple. The next morning, Leah called before 9. She said my father's general counsel had contacted her late the previous evening, informally, to ask whether a productive solution might still be possible. There it was, the translation of fear into professionalism. I asked what she had said. She said only that if they wanted productivity, they should bring seriousness rather than sentiment. I smiled despite myself. Then she asked whether I was ready for a more formal process. I said yes. By noon, Sterling Industrial's board had scheduled a continuity review session for Friday. Not a full board vote, not yet, but enough of an emergency meeting to signal real concern. Benton had clearly done more than ask questions. He had been making calls. The company felt different that week, not louder, quieter. People lowered their voices when I passed, not out of gossip exactly, but attention. The kind of charged attentiveness organizations develop when everyone senses some hidden mechanism is being touched. Assistants were careful. Managers documented more. Finance copied more people than usual. Compliance suddenly wanted follow-up language tightened in memos it had ignored for months. Thursday afternoon brought the first real sign of Julian's panic. He came to my house, unannounced. I almost did not open the door when I saw him through the glass. But curiosity won. He stood on my porch in a dark jacket, hair damp from mist, looking less polished than usual. Not undone exactly, just insufficiently arranged. He asked if he could come in. I said no. So he stayed on the porch. For a moment, he looked almost like a younger version of himself from years ago, before executive grooming and inherited certainty hardened into style. Then he ruined it by saying he needed me to stop escalating things. I asked whether he had mistaken my front steps for the boardroom. He ignored that. He said lenders were asking questions. People were talking. Father was furious. Marianne had become impossible. And if I kept pushing, the whole company could destabilize. There was the family doctrine again, the burden flowing downhill toward the most conscientious son. I asked him whether he had come to apologize or recruit. He said neither. He said he was trying to be practical. I leaned against the door frame and waited. Then he made his offer. He said if I backed off now, if I stopped feeding Benton concerns, stopped involving lawyers, stopped turning private family disagreements into governance problems, he would make sure I was protected. He said he could push for real compensation, for visible acknowledgement, maybe even for a joint public positioning that recognized my importance. I stared at him. Then I asked if he truly heard himself when he spoke. He frowned. I said he was standing on my porch offering me scraps of my own life as if they were concessions from his generosity. That hit. Good. He said this was bigger than childhood grievances. I said yes. It had become governance, because his childhood privileges had been turned into corporate architecture. Then he did something I had never seen him do before. He dropped the performance. Just for a second. He said he was scared. The honesty of it changed the air. He said he knew he could not run the company without me, not really. He said Father had always promised things would settle, that experience would come, that people would support him, that my intensity would eventually make me prefer the back end anyway. He said he had believed more of it than he should have. Then he said if I left now, Father would still try to force him into the front position, and the company would eat him alive. I looked at him for a long time. Because for the first time, I was not hearing entitlement speak. I was hearing the child at the center of my resentment finally noticing the size of the costume he had been told was his birthright. I asked whether he wanted truth. He said yes. I said Father had not loved either of us correctly. He had used me for stability and used you for image. The difference was that being used for image feels like privilege until the bill arrives. Julian's face tightened. I think that may have been the first real wound I ever gave him. Not because it was cruel, but because it reframed his entire life in one sentence. He said then, "What am I supposed to do?" Because there are tragedies inside systems like ours, and not everyone who benefits from injustice understands early enough that they are also being shaped by it. But understanding late does not erase what their comfort cost other people. I told him to stop asking me to rescue the version of the future Father built around a lie. He asked if that meant I wanted him destroyed. I said no. I wanted him responsible. He stood there in the damp cold with his hands in his pockets, looking younger and smaller than I had seen him in years. Then he asked something that surprised me. He asked whether, if Father were not in the picture, I would actually want the company. I answered honestly. I said I did not know anymore. Because once you spend enough years bleeding into a machine, the fantasy of finally owning it can begin to feel less like victory and more like inheriting the scene of the injury. Julian nodded slowly, as if that answer unsettled him more than ambition would have. Then he said Father would never step aside willingly. I said I know. He left after that. Just a brother walking off my porch carrying, maybe for the first time, a weight that had always been scheduled for someone else. Friday's continuity review began at 8 in the morning and lasted almost 6 hours. Board subset, outside counsel, finance, compliance, my father, Julian, me, and one quiet consultant taking notes with the grim focus of a man who sensed he might someday be subpoenaed. The tone from the start was wrong for my father. Too factual, too specific, too uninterested in his charm. Benton opened by saying the purpose of the meeting was straightforward: to assess concentration risk, leadership credibility, succession readiness, and exposure created by any gap between formal structure and actual operational dependency. No one used the word favoritism. No one needed to. I was asked to present first. Not a speech, an assessment. So I gave one. I outlined the operational architecture of Sterling Industrial as it really existed, the undocumented dependencies, the areas where crisis knowledge lived in practice rather than policy, the labor relationships built over years, the client trust that attached to credibility more than titles, the vendor history, the plant vulnerabilities, the sequencing required for any genuine leadership transition. Then I outlined the risks introduced when authority, visibility, and competence drift out of alignment. I did not editorialize. I did not accuse. I did not mention childhood. I did not mention love. I described the machine. And by describing the machine, I described the lie. Questions followed. Precise ones. How much of this had been formalized? Why had redundancy not been built earlier? Who approved recent reporting restructures that increased response delays? Why had Julian's office been given certain communication controls without corresponding operational mastery? What would a responsible transition actually require? What would happen if I departed in 90 days? In 30? Immediately? I answered all of it. Then they asked Julian to speak. To his credit, he did not try to bluff as hard as usual. Fear had improved him. He admitted he was still learning. He said he had relied too heavily on broad strategic positioning and not enough on operational immersion. He said some structures had moved faster than his readiness justified. It was not noble, exactly, but it was the closest thing to humility I had ever heard from him in a board setting. Then they turned to my father. This was the part I will remember for the rest of my life, not because of what he said, because of what happened when saying stopped working. At first he tried the usual style: legacy, complementary strengths, planned evolution, differing leadership profiles, the dangers of over-centralizing around any one individual, the importance of representation and stakeholder confidence. Then Benton interrupted him, and asked directly whether the board had, at any point, been given a truthful picture of the gap between Daniel's actual role and Julian's actual preparedness. The room went very still. My father said the board had been given every material fact relevant to continuity planning. Benton asked whether that included the succession memo describing me as the strongest operational candidate by far, but difficult to center without complicating the legacy line. My father looked at me, then at Marianne, who was not even in the room but somehow present all the same. Then at Benton. That silence told its own story. He said preliminary internal notes should not be overinterpreted. Benton asked again. Had the board been given that truth or not? My father's face hardened. He said no. There it was. No thunder, no shouting, just one syllable collapsing years of performance. Then outside counsel asked whether family image considerations had ever materially influenced succession positioning. My father began to answer with some qualified phrase. Benton cut him off again and said yes or no would be preferable. My father did not say yes, but he did not say no either. He spoke for nearly 2 minutes without touching either word, which is how powerful men confess when their vocabulary no longer protects them. By the time he finished, the room understood. Maybe it had understood already, but now it had witness. There was a break after that. People stood. Coffee was refreshed. No one made eye contact the way they normally would after a tense meeting. I walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stared out over the parking lot, gray sky hanging low above the line of trees beyond the access road. Leah had not attended, but her preparation was everywhere in me. Every sentence she had helped sharpen. Every point she had made about outcomes, leverage, and refusing to drift back into the role of grateful son the moment pressure rose. When the meeting resumed, Benton spoke first. He said the board would require immediate corrective action, a formal continuity map, authority realignment, independent transition planning, a freeze on further public succession signaling until readiness and governance matched. And most critically, a retention or separation solution for me that reflected actual operational dependence and reduced enterprise risk. My father objected. Of course he did. He said the board was overstepping into family territory. Benton said once family territory creates enterprise risk, it stops being private. That sentence may have been the second most important gift anyone gave me in this whole ordeal. Then the outside counsel recommended executive mediation and temporary oversight provisions. Temporary oversight provisions. For the first time in his life, I think my father understood that the room no longer believed him entitled to sole authorship of the future. The meeting ended without final resolution, but with deadlines: 48 hours for a proposal, 1 week for structural recommendations. No independent action by my father or Julian in the meantime regarding titles, transitions, or messaging. When I got back to my office, there was a handwritten note on my desk. No signature. Just 6 words. Now they know what he did. I sat down slowly after reading it, because that was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Maybe not everything. Maybe not enough. But that. Witness. The truth was still expensive, still unfinished, still tangled in contracts, pride, and whatever shredded remains of family we were all pretending not to step on. But now, it was no longer mine alone to carry. Late that evening, after most of the building had emptied, Benton asked if I had a minute. I followed him into the smaller conference room. He closed the door and did not sit. He said I had 3 real options as he saw them. 1, stay, but only if the board forced a genuine structural correction and I actually wanted the burden of rebuilding under those terms. 2, negotiate an exit substantial enough to reflect my value and protect my record. 3, leverage the crisis into something larger. Board-backed authority over transition itself, which could mean effectively taking the company without using that phrase. Then he asked me which one I wanted. I looked at the dark glass wall, my own reflection faint in it, tie loosened, shoulders tired, face older than I used to imagine it becoming. I thought about my mother's notebook, about Julian on my porch, about my father at the club window, still believing dignity could be rationed downward, about 20 years of wanting something that had never once arrived in the right form. Then I said the hardest truth of all. I said I did not yet know whether winning the company would be freedom or simply a more expensive version of staying inside the wound. Benton nodded like a man who respected that answer more than certainty. He said then figure it out quickly, because if I did not choose soon, my father would choose for me again. And that was the real cliff edge. Not whether the company would survive, not whether the board now saw the truth, not whether my father had finally been exposed. The real question was whether I would spend the first fully open moment of my life taking the throne I had once wanted, or finally walking away from the kingdom built on my erasure. I did not make the decision that night. I wish I could say clarity arrived like revelation. A clean answer, a noble certainty, something that would have made the next steps feel worthy of the years it had taken to get there. Instead, I went home, loosened my tie in the kitchen, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I did not really want, and sat at my table with the lights off except for the small one over the stove. The house was quiet in that way only solitary homes can be, not peaceful, precise. I set my mother's notebook beside the glass and stared at it for a long time without opening it. Then I finally did, not to search for guidance. Dead mothers are often forced into too much wisdom by the living. She had not left me a map. She had left me fragments, observations, warnings written in the language available to a woman who understood the character of the man she had married long before I understood the shape of the man who raised me. I turned pages slowly until I found the line again. If I am gone, I hope no one teaches my son that love must be earned through usefulness. That sentence had been stalking me ever since I first read it. Because that was the real inheritance, wasn't it? Not the company, not the titles, not the board scrutiny, not the money now suddenly being discussed in careful professional terms, because men like my father only discover value once the asset threatens to leave. No. The real inheritance was the belief that if I carried enough, solved enough, endured enough, fixed enough, then one day I would be chosen correctly. Everything else had grown from that poison. The company itself was simply the most expensive theater in which I had continued acting it out. I sat there until the bourbon went warm in the glass. Then I called Leah. It was late enough that I expected voicemail, but she answered on the second ring. She did not say hello the way most people do. She said what happened. I smiled despite myself. I told her Benton had laid out my 3 options: stay and force structural correction, negotiate an exit, leverage the crisis into effective control of the company. She listened. Then she asked which answer scared me most. That was such an irritatingly lawyer-like question that I almost laughed. But I answered honestly. I said taking control scared me most. She asked why. I said because for too many years control had been the fantasy that explained my obedience. The idea that if I held on long enough, if I bore enough, the company would one day become the proof that my father had been wrong, that I had been worth the front of the room all along. And now that the possibility was real, I could not tell whether wanting it meant I had finally earned something, or whether I was still bargaining with the same wound, just at a higher level. Leah was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I would carry with me through everything that followed. She said, "There is a difference between claiming power and asking power to heal you." She told me the first can build a future. The second usually rebuilds the injury in a corner office. Then she said if I chose to take the company, I had better do it because I genuinely wanted the work, the authority, the burden, and the shape of the life that came with it. Not because I wanted my father to finally see me standing where he had refused to place me. I thanked her. She said not yet. Then she told me to sleep before making permanent decisions out of adrenaline and grief. I slept badly anyway. The next morning was Sunday, gray and raw, the kind of cold that turns the city's edges metallic. I drove without much destination for nearly an hour before I realized I was heading toward the cemetery where my mother was buried. I had not been there in months, maybe longer. The grounds were nearly empty, cold grass gone pale at the edges, trees stripped thin by the season, a maintenance cart in the distance. I stood at her stone with my hands in my coat pockets and no flowers because I had not planned to come, and somehow that felt more honest. I told her nothing aloud. I have never been one of those people who narrates to the dead as if they are delayed but still attending. I just stood there, and because there was nowhere else for the thought to go, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I did not want the company the way I had once imagined wanting it. I wanted justice. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted my father exposed. I wanted the architecture named. I wanted the years not to disappear into family mythology once I stepped away. But I did not want to spend the next 20 years living inside the same machine that had trained me to confuse sacrifice with love. That realization did not feel like peace. It felt like mourning. Because it meant the thing I had once believed would redeem my suffering, the company itself, could not do it. Not even if I won. Maybe especially not if I won. By noon, I knew my answer. Not all of it, but enough. I called Benton and asked to meet Monday before anyone else arrived. He agreed without surprise, which told me he had already guessed. When I got to headquarters the next morning, the building felt more brittle than usual. Too many closed doors, too much soft movement. News of Friday's review had not gone wide, but it had gone far enough. Organizations develop a smell when fear gets into the ventilation. Not literal, of course. More a shift in human texture. Assistants over-explaining calendars. Managers speaking with extra care. People standing half a beat too long outside conference rooms before deciding whether to knock. Benton met me in the small boardroom just after 7. Coffee. No preamble. No witnesses. He asked if I had decided. I said yes. Then I told him. I said I would not pursue control of Sterling Industrial. He did not look disappointed exactly, just focused. I said if the board believed the company's continuity genuinely depended on me, then that dependence had to be converted into 2 things: a serious transition process and a departure agreement that reflected reality, not sentiment. I said I would remain for a defined period under board-supervised terms to stabilize transition, document systems, protect client confidence, and reduce enterprise risk. In return, I wanted formal public acknowledgement of my role, a separation package proportionate to my operational value and years of executive labor, preservation of my professional record, and written governance corrections, so no internal rewrite could turn me into a cautionary tale about burnout or temperament. Benton listened without interruption. Then he asked the only question that mattered. He asked whether I was certain. I said yes. And for the first time since this all began, I was. Because the decision no longer felt like strategy. It felt like refusal. Refusal to let the company become one more chamber in the same house my father had built inside me. Benton nodded slowly. Then he said my father would hate this outcome more than losing a direct fight for control. I asked why. He gave the faintest hint of a smile. He said because men like my father can survive defeat if defeat still centers them. What they cannot bear is being understood and left standing in the ruins of their own design while the person they built it around refuses the throne entirely. That was exactly right. And suddenly I saw the shape of the loss my father had never imagined. He had spent decades arranging the company as a stage on which my brother could be displayed and I could be contained. If I took the company, he could still tell himself the story had remained dynastic, just corrected through conflict. But if I took my value, my witness, my truth, and my labor, and walked away on terms the board itself had to ratify, then he would be left with what he had actually chosen all along. Julian, untested, unready, no longer protected by my invisible rescue, and no longer able to blame my loyalty for cushioning the consequences. Benton asked if I wanted him to begin shaping that outcome immediately. I said yes. Then I added one more condition. I wanted the public acknowledgement written carefully enough that it could not be diluted into generic praise. I wanted the company to say plainly that I had led core operational continuity across a decade of growth and volatility, and that my transition followed successful stabilization and governance realignment. He nodded once and said that was reasonable. Reasonable. What a small word for the first moment of fairness in years. The board proposal moved fast after that. Faster than I expected, which meant fear was doing its work beautifully. By mid-afternoon, outside counsel had circulated a framework. A 6-month transition term for me, board supervised. Immediate freeze on Julian's succession branding. Creation of an interim continuity committee reporting to the board. Formal elevation of operational decision-making into documented governance channels. A negotiated separation package at the end of 6 months, subject to final financial terms. And a requirement that all internal and external messaging about leadership evolution be jointly reviewed until the transition concluded. The offer was not perfect, but it was serious, which meant my father would despise it. He called me just before 5, not texted. Called, I answered. He did not disguise his anger this time. He asked if I had conspired with Benton to humiliate him. I said no. I had finally stopped protecting him from the cost of his own decisions. He said the board was overreacting and being manipulated by people who did not understand the family. I said the board understood the company, which was the problem. He asked whether I really intended to walk away rather than claim what I had supposedly wanted all these years. That word supposedly did a lot of work. I told him yes. He was silent for a second. Then he said, I knew you never truly had the stomach for it. That one almost made me laugh out loud, because there it was again, even now. If I fought him, I was bitter. If I refused the kingdom, I was weak. No possible action could ever be interpreted by him as wisdom if it was not obedience wearing better shoes. I said no, Father. I had the stomach for building it. What I no longer have is the appetite for inheriting a wound and pretending it is a reward. He exhaled sharply through his nose. Then he asked the question beneath all the others. He asked if I was doing this to punish him. I sat at my desk and looked out through the glass toward the dimming parking lot. Then I answered with more mercy than he deserved. I said no. I was doing it to stop organizing my life around being chosen by someone who had already made his choice years ago. He hung up. Julian came to my office an hour later. He closed the door behind him, but did not sit. He looked exhausted. Not theatrically, really. The kind of fatigue that comes when your self-concept has been asked to hold more weight than it was built for. He asked if it was true. I said yes. He asked if I was really leaving after 6 months. I said yes. He looked at the floor, then back at me. Then he asked why I would not take it. I considered giving him the polished answer. Freedom, new chapter, life beyond the company. But he had come to me stripped enough that I decided not to lie. I told him because I had spent too long believing that if I stood where Father refused to put me, the years would make sense. And now that I could see the path clearly, I understood the company could never give me back what it had taken to stay. Not my 20s, not the shape of my self-respect, not the version of love I had confused with endurance. I said taking it might prove I was capable. But I no longer needed the proof badly enough to live the rest of my life inside the evidence. He stood very still after that. Then he said he did not know whether to admire me or hate me. I said that sounded like progress. That got the first honest laugh I had heard from him in months. It disappeared quickly. Then he asked what he was supposed to do. Again, that question. Always from the child who had been told the world would arrange itself if he smiled correctly. I told him what I should have told him years ago. I said, learn. For once, actually learn. Stop auditioning for inheritance and start understanding consequence. Go to the plants. Listen more than you speak. Ask the supervisors what they know before telling them what the future looks like. Read the contracts you wave around. Sit with finance until the numbers stop sounding like mood music and start sounding like obligations. And above all, stop expecting people who paid for your illusions to keep protecting you from the price. He nodded slowly. Then he asked whether I thought he could do it. That question was softer than the others. Younger. I answered honestly. I said maybe, but not as the man he had been. Only as the one this had frightened enough to finally begin. He took that in. Then he said Father would never forgive either of us for this. I said I know. He gave me a long look as if trying to memorize something too late. Then he left. The next week became negotiation, numbers, language, governance provisions, timing, announcement structure. Retention bonuses for key operational staff during transition, board review rights, non-disparagement language, reference language, equity valuation, advisory limitations after departure. My father fought every piece of it indirectly, which was his preferred method. He let counsel object, revise, soften, delay. He tried to reduce the public language to elegant fog. He tried to reshape the economics into gratitude theater. He wanted the money high enough to buy my silence, but the wording vague enough to preserve his myth. Leah killed that version, line by line. Watching her work was like watching a surgeon who hated unnecessary drama and therefore became far more devastating than dramatic people ever managed. She stripped sentiment out of every clause. She kept the numbers serious. She tightened the public statement. She refused any wording that implied my departure was motivated by fatigue, personal preference for private life, or natural transition after years of valued support. That last phrase, she told opposing counsel, was especially offensive. I nearly loved her for that. At one point, my father's counsel suggested language describing me as a critical behind-the-scenes force. Leah responded that my client was not leaving a theater troupe. By the third week, the deal was nearly done. Then my father made his last play. He requested a private meeting, board approved, at headquarters, conference room on the legal floor, counsel nearby but not in the room unless requested. I knew before I entered that he was desperate, because desperation was the only thing that would make him risk directness. after counsel had taken over most of the conversation. He was standing when I came in. No jacket this time. Just shirt sleeves and the particular stiffness of a man who had been sleeping badly in expensive bedding. He asked whether I had really thought all of this through. I said yes. He said I was making an irreversible mistake. I asked which part he meant. He said walking away from the family. Interesting. Not the company. The family? I told him the family had mostly been where this started. He ignored that. He said once the agreement was signed, nothing would ever be the same between us. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, with more sadness than anger, that nothing had been the same since the day he decided I was strong enough to carry what he intended to give to someone else. He flinched. A small thing, but real. Then he tried a different route. He said he had done what he thought was best for the company. I said no. He had done what was most flattering to his story of the company. He said Julian needed time. I said so did I, but somehow my time had always been billed to competence instead of granted as mercy. He said I had no idea how hard it had been to balance everything. Wife, children, board, reputation, legacy, that word again, legacy, the shrine at which he had burned every honest possibility. I said I actually believed him that it had been hard. I just no longer believed difficulty made his choices sacred. That was the closest we came to real conversation. For a moment, the room lost some of its legal chill. He looked older than ever, tired in a way money could not pad, not broken. Men like him are rarely broken by the things that break others, but worn open at the edges. Then he asked me something he should have asked 30 years earlier. He asked whether I had hated him. I did not answer immediately, because the truth mattered. Finally, I said no. I had wanted him, wanted his approval, his respect, his clear-eyed recognition, wanted him to look at what I built and say, without reservation or comparison or strategic dilution, this is my son, and I trust him. I said hatred would have been simpler. He took that like a blow. Good. Then I told him one more thing. I said the deepest cruelty was not that he favored Julian. Parents fail in uneven ways all the time. The deepest cruelty was that he saw exactly what I was capable of and built a life in which that capability would keep serving him while never becoming permission for me to stand fully in the light. He sat down after that. Just sat, as if his body had run out of rhetoric before his mind had. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, that he thought I would stay. There it was, the governing assumption of my whole life. He thought I would stay, because I always had, because I always fixed it, because boys trained to earn love through usefulness often remain longer than anyone deserves. I picked up my coat. Then I said the last sentence I would ever need to say to him as a son seeking explanation. I said I know, and that is why I have to go. The agreement was signed 4 days later. The numbers were large enough to make the financial press curious if they ever learned them, though they never did. Equity, deferred compensation, transition premium, advisory limitations, protected record language, serious terms. Not gift money, not hush money, value finally forced into a form that could survive without affection. The public announcement went out the next Monday. Sterling Industrial Today announced a structured 6-month operational transition led by Daniel Sterling, whose leadership has guided core continuity, systems execution, and enterprise stability across a decade of growth and volatility. The board expressed deep appreciation for his central role in strengthening the company's operational resilience and confirmed that governance and continuity planning measures are being formalized during this transition period. I read it twice, not because it was perfect, because it was real enough. My phone lit up for hours. Former colleagues, suppliers, plant managers, a retired supervisor I had not spoken to in 3 years, a lender contact, even 2 clients. Most of the messages said some version of the same thing. About time. Everyone knew you deserved better. Thank you for what you built. One message had no name attached, just 6 words again. Now they know what you did. The 6 months that followed were the strangest of my life. I did the work. Fully, cleanly. No sabotage, no quiet revenge, no poisoned handoff. Because leaving with integrity mattered more to me than any cheap satisfaction people imagined revenge was supposed to provide. I documented the systems, redistributed knowledge where possible, forced departments to learn the interdependencies they had been content to let me carry invisibly, built real reporting maps, installed actual escalation pathways, identified key people whose retention mattered more than any family title, made Julian come with me to plants, made him sit in rooms where no one cared about his smile, made him hear hard questions from supervisors who had spent years watching him float above the consequences of decisions they had to live under. Sometimes he improved, sometimes he backslid, but he was never the same after that review. Fear had matured him where love and privilege had only preserved him. As for my father, he remained chairman, but diminished. Not formally at first. Socially, strategically. The board no longer let him speak about continuity as if it were a private mood. His authority became more supervised, his charisma less trusted. He still wore the same suits, hosted the same dinners, carried himself with the same carefully measured gravity. But once a room sees the mechanism behind the performance never quite recovers. That was his real loss. Not me. Not the money. Not even control. Witness. He had been seen clearly and seen by the kind of people who mattered to him most. Marianne sent me one note during the 4th month of transition. No explanation, no request, just a short card. You leaving was the first honest thing anyone in this family has done in years. I put it in my desk and never answered. Julian and I grew, not close, but possible. That is the best word for it. Possible. We had lunch twice after formal meetings, once without talking about the company for almost 15 minutes, once talking about it only. Toward the end of my transition, he said he finally understood why everyone always seemed calmer when I walked into a crisis. He said it was not confidence exactly. It was that I had already imagined the consequences before everyone else had finished naming the problem. I told him that is what responsibility feels like when no one mistakes it for talent. He nodded. Then he said he was sorry. Not enough to heal childhood, not enough to repay cost, but sincere. I accepted it, not because he had earned absolution, because I no longer wanted to carry him as unfinished business. My final day arrived in early autumn. Bright morning, cool air, clear sky. I wore one of my better suits, not for ceremony, but because endings deserve some respect even when the institution earning it has been inconsistent. My office was almost empty by then. 2 boxes. A framed photo of my mother. A small brass component from the first line I had helped redesign years earlier. My laptop waiting for final handoff. Arturo came in around 10 with coffee from the terrible place downstairs that somehow still got everyone's order wrong after 8 years. He set it on my desk and said the floor was taking bets on whether I would feel lighter or angrier by noon. I said, "What did you tell them?" He shrugged and said both. We laughed. Then he got serious. He said the company would survive. Messily, maybe. Differently, certainly. But survive. Then he added that some places only become honest after the right person leaves. That stayed with me. Around 11:30, Benton stopped by. No audience, no ceremony. He shook my hand and thanked me. Then he said something that sounded almost like apology, though he was too old and careful to dress it that way. He said boards like to imagine they eventually see everything important. We do not. Usually we see it only after someone has already paid too much. I told him that was probably true of more than boards. He smiled once and left. My father did not come. Not to my office, not to the floor, not to the lobby. Part of me had expected some final encounter anyway, a gesture, a last assertion, a dignified half-reconciliation designed mostly to protect his self-image. Nothing came, which was, in its way, the cleanest ending possible. He remained who he had always been. At 12:15, I walked out carrying one box. Reception had arranged a polite little send-off table with coffee and pastries nobody wanted but everyone appreciated as an excuse to gather. There were handshakes, a few awkward hugs, too many eyes avoiding too much feeling. People from departments that had rarely been visible in my life came out anyway. One of the shipping coordinators cried. That almost undid me more than anything else. Julian stood near the back. When the small cluster thinned, he stepped forward and held out his hand. Then, after a second, he pulled it back and hugged me instead. Quick, not performative. Real enough. He said, I am going to make mistakes. I said yes. He said, I know that is not permission. I said no. But it is the beginning of education. He almost smiled. Then he said, I am glad it was you who taught me that, even if I deserved harsher lessons first. I told him life would provide those anyway. Then I left. The parking lot looked ordinary. That was what surprised me most. No cinematic weather, no dramatic music, no inward voice announcing the close of an era with any wisdom worth quoting. Just sunlight on windshields, a truck backing out too fast, leaves beginning to gather along the curb, my box in my hands, my key fob suddenly useless. I put the box in the passenger seat and stood there for a moment with the door open, waiting, maybe, for grief, or triumph, or some grand release proportionate to the years. What came instead was smaller, space, not joy yet, not freedom fully formed, just space where duty had been. And in that space, for the first time I can remember, I did not feel like the son carrying the family's unspoken terms. I did not feel like the executive translating chaos into order for people who would never call that love. I did not feel like the invisible mechanism inside someone else's story. I just felt like a man with a road in front of him and no one left to ask permission from. A month later, I bought a small house on the Maine coast. Not extravagant. Wood shingles, big windows, a study overlooking water that changed color by the hour. Enough quiet to hear yourself become someone else if you stayed still long enough. Leah visited once in late October and brought wine better than the place deserved. We sat on the deck in coats while the wind came in off the water sharp enough to keep us honest. She asked whether I regretted not taking the company. I looked at the water before answering. Then I said no. I regretted that there had ever been a version of me who needed it to mean I had mattered. She nodded, like that was the answer she had been waiting to hear all along. As for Sterling Industrial, it lived. Messily, as Arturo predicted. Julian struggled, learned, backslid, recovered. Lost one major client his first year. Retained two others by finally listening instead of presenting. The board kept him on a shorter leash than he would ever have tolerated before. Maybe that saved him. Maybe it saved the company. Maybe those are the same thing. My father remained chairman for another 18 months before being eased into an emeritus role so ceremonial it was almost satire. He kept his office for appearances. Lost his authorship and practice. I heard that bothered him more than retirement would have. I never went back. Not for holidays, not for charity galas, not for the careful family photographs that had once disguised imbalance as unity. When Marianne wrote after he stepped down, I did not answer that either. Some endings do not need hostility. They just need refusal. The last time Julian called, around a year after I left, he asked if I would ever consider consulting informally during a supply issue they were navigating. I told him no. He was quiet a moment, then said good. I asked what that meant. He said it meant he was finally learning the difference between missing me and expecting me. That was the first thing he ever said that made me think he might truly survive becoming himself. So that is the story of how my father made me run his company for 10 years while telling everyone my younger brother was the real heir, and how losing the throne turned out to be the first thing that was ever truly mine. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe to Bedtime Threads, and tell me in the comments, would you have taken the company or walked away like I did?